London, 1816. Miss Harriet Thornfield had long ago accepted her fate. At 26 years of age and having endured 7 unsuccessful seasons, she recognized her position in society with the clear-eyed practicality that had become her hallmark. While the other young ladies of the ton draped themselves in pastel silks and perfected coy glances from behind fluttering fans, Harriet found solace in the leather-bound companions that lined her father's extensive library. "You would do well to consider a new gown for Lady Wexford's ball," her mother suggested over breakfast, not for the first time that week. "The modiste mentioned a shipment of French silk has just arrived, in the most becoming shade of peach." Harriet reached for her teacup, hiding her grimace behind the Wedgwood rim. "I fail to see how draping myself in peach silk would suddenly render me marriageable, mother. The ton has quite decided on my prospects, and no amount of French finery will alter that assessment." Lady Thornfield's sigh was a familiar melody in their morning ritual. "If you would only apply yourself to the social graces with the same vigor you devote to your studies, then I should be equally unsuccessful, but considerably more exhausted," Harriet concluded, returning to the astronomical journal spread before her plate. Jupiter's moons had proven far more reliable companions than the gentlemen of Mayfair. The truth that hung unspoken between mother and daughter was simple: Harriet Thornfield was not pretty. Her features were neither offensive nor remarkable, merely ordinary, with a nose slightly too pronounced and a mouth somewhat too wide for fashionable beauty. She possessed neither the golden curls nor the delicate constitution that defined the desirable debutante. Worse still, she had the unfortunate habit of speaking her mind, particularly on subjects deemed unsuitable for feminine conversation. Too plain for marriage, and too clever for her own good, Lady Bromley had once pronounced within Harriet's hearing at a musicale, setting the ton's opinion in stone more permanent than marble. Harriet had constructed her life around this assessment. If marriage was to be denied her, she would embrace the freedoms of spinsterhood, the liberty to read what she wished, to pursue knowledge without restraint, to avoid the tedium of balls and the disappointment of being a perpetual wallflower. "I have quite reconciled myself to becoming your companion in your dotage, mother," Harriet said lightly, turning a page. "We shall be terribly content, discussing the weather and complaining about the servants." Lady Thornfield's expression softened. "My dear girl, you deserve more than resignation to a life half-lived." Harriet met her mother's gaze. "One cannot desire what society has deemed impossible. I have made peace with my prospects." Yet peace, like so many conditions in the capricious world of the ton, proved devastatingly temporary. The disruption arrived a fortnight later at Lady Wexford's ball, where Harriet had indeed worn her old blue gown rather than succumb to the peach silk in the form of Lord Alexander Winthrop, the recently returned Viscount Halsey. Harriet first noticed him not because of his striking appearance, though with his tall frame, angular features, and piercing grey eyes, he certainly commanded attention, but because he was leaning against the library doorframe, watching her with undisguised curiosity. She had slipped away from the ballroom after fulfilling her obligatory 2 dances with elderly gentlemen who favored her as a partner precisely because she harbored no expectations. Lady Wexford's library had beckoned, and Harriet had answered its call, losing herself in a fascinating volume on Egyptian hieroglyphics until the distinct sensation of being observed drew her attention. "I beg your pardon," she said, closing the book with more haste than care. "I did not mean to intrude." The Viscount tilted his head slightly. "I believe it is I who am intruding, as you were here first." His voice carried the faint trace of a northern accent beneath the polished tones of privilege. "Though I confess, I did not expect to find anyone in the library during a ball." "Nor I," Harriet replied, rising and smoothing her gown. "I shall return to the ballroom immediately. Please don't leave on my account." He stepped into the room, his expression curious rather than condemning. "I merely sought respite from the matrimonial battlefield." I've endured 3 introductions to eligible young ladies in the past half hour, each accompanied by a maternal gaze that assessed my worth down to the last farthing. Despite herself, Harriet smiled. The Tun's marriage market is nothing if not efficient, my lord. Brutally so. He gestured to the book she still held. What volume commanded your attention while violins played and fortunes were pursued through quadrilles? Harriet hesitated, experience having taught her that gentlemen rarely appreciated a woman's interest in academic subjects. An examination of Egyptian writing systems. Rather dull, I'm afraid. On the contrary. He approached, his interest appearing genuine. Champollion's work, perhaps? I understand he's making remarkable progress with the Rosetta Stone. Surprise rendered Harriet momentarily speechless. You're familiar with Egyptology. I spent 3 years traveling the Mediterranean, he replied, moving to examine the bookshelves. Including 6 months in Egypt. The ancient civilizations possess a fascinating history, though I found the heat decidedly unpleasant. I've only traveled through books, Harriet admitted. Though I've developed quite an immunity to paper dust in the process. His laugh was unexpected, warm and genuine. A hazard of intellectual exploration, to be sure. May I? He gestured to the chair opposite hers. The conversation that followed was unlike any Harriet had experienced in a ballroom setting. Lord Halsey spoke of archaeological digs and ancient temples, of scholars' debates in Paris salons and the political complications of acquiring artifacts. More surprisingly still, he asked her opinions and listened to her responses with genuine interest. You possess a remarkable mind, Miss Thornfield, he said finally, after she'd offered an insightful observation about the symbolic parallels between hieroglyphics and Chinese characters. A dubious compliment in the marriage market, my lord, she replied, the words escaping before prudence could contain them. His expression shifted subtly. Is that the market in which you're currently trading? Hardly. Harriet allowed herself a small, self-deprecating smile. My value was assessed and found wanting several seasons ago. I merely attend such functions to please my mother. Something flickered in his eyes, not pity, which she would have despised, but a kind of recognition. Then we are both refugees from expectation. I returned to England to fulfill family obligations, only to discover society has scripted my future without consulting my preferences. Before Harriet could respond, the library door opened to reveal her mother, whose expression cycled rapidly from concern to surprise to careful neutrality upon discovering her daughter engaged in private conversation with the season's most eligible bachelor. Harriet, dear, I've been searching everywhere, Lady Thornfield said, her voice a study in controlled excitement. Lord Halsey rose immediately. The fault is entirely mine, Lady Thornfield. I've monopolized your daughter's conversation while discussing Egyptian antiquities. He turned to Harriet with a slight bow. Miss Thornfield, thank you for a most enlightening discussion. Perhaps we might continue it another time. As he took his leave, Harriet found herself experiencing an unfamiliar sensation, a mixture of pleasure and disorientation, as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis while she wasn't attending. Viscount Halsey sought your company, her mother whispered when he was safely out of earshot. The man who inherited 3 estates and is said to have doubled his fortune abroad. He sought intellectual conversation, Harriet corrected. Nothing more. But Lord Halsey's parting words proved prophetic. 3 days later, he appeared at the Thornfield residence during calling hours, bearing a book on Egyptian archaeology that he insisted would interest her. The following week, he encountered her by chance in the park while she walked with her mother. Within a fortnight, the Tun buzzed with speculation about his apparent interest in the unremarkable Miss Thornfield. "It cannot possibly be a serious attachment," Lady Bromley declared loudly at a musical evening, her voice carrying precisely as she intended. "A man of his standing? With his looks and fortune? No, he must have some other purpose." Harriet, seated nearby with her mother, felt the familiar sting of society's assessment, but it was accompanied by a new sensation, indignation. "Perhaps he values qualities beyond a pretty face and a substantial dowry," she said, loud enough to be heard by those nearest, including Lady Bromley. The older woman's eyebrows rose to unprecedented heights. "My dear Miss Thornfield, a man may appreciate a clever mind, but he marries beauty and fortune. That is the way of the world." What made the exchange particularly mortifying was Lord Halsey's entrance into the room moments later, his timing suggesting he might have overheard the exchange. The slight tightening around his mouth as he glanced toward Lady Bromley confirmed Harriet's fear. "Miss Thornfield," he said, approaching with a formal bow, "I wonder if I might claim the honor of turning pages for you, should you perform this evening?" The invitation was both a social lifeline and a public alignment. By the evening's end, even Lady Bromley was forced to acknowledge that the Viscount's attentions appeared genuinely directed toward Harriet. Yet doubt lingered. As Lord Halsey's calls became more frequent and his attentions more marked, Harriet found herself increasingly wary. Experience had taught her that society's rules were immutable. Handsome, wealthy viscounts did not marry plain, bookish spinsters, regardless of how stimulating their conversations might be. "You cannot possibly intend to discourage him," her mother said one afternoon after the Viscount had departed following a particularly animated discussion on the scientific merits of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. "I merely maintain perspective," Harriet replied, arranging her embroidery threads with unnecessary precision. "Men of his station may enjoy intellectual diversions, but they marry to advantage." Lady Thornfield studied her daughter. "You protect yourself from disappointment by anticipating it." Harriet looked up sharply. "I protect myself from becoming a cautionary tale. The spinster who mistook courtesy for courtship. I have no wish to provide the ton with fresh gossip." The invitation to Lord Halsey's country estate for a weekend gathering arrived the following week, addressed to the entire Thornfield family. It represented a significant escalation in his attentions, an introduction to his ancestral home, his closest friends, his private world. "We must accept," her mother declared immediately. Harriet's anxiety manifested as opposition. "It would be more prudent to decline. Such an invitation will only fuel speculation." "Perhaps speculation is warranted," her father interjected, looking up from his newspaper. "The Viscount's intentions appear honorable." "His intentions remain a mystery," Harriet insisted. "And I have no wish to build castles from clouds." Nevertheless, the invitation was accepted, and 3 weeks later, the Thornfield carriage rolled up the long drive to Winthrop Manor, a handsome stone residence nestled amid ancient oaks and precisely manicured gardens. Lord Halsey greeted them personally, his genuine pleasure at their arrival evident in his smile. "Miss Thornfield, I've been eagerly anticipating your assessment of my library. Third generation, primarily scientific and historical works, with a regrettable shortage of Greek translations that I hope to remedy." "You tempt me with literary treasures, my lord," Harriet replied, feeling oddly breathless. "How very tactical." His eyes crinkled at the corners. "I employ what advantages I possess." The house party proved unlike any social gathering Harriet had previously attended. Rather than the usual assemblage of matchmaking mothers and giggling debutantes, Lord Halsey had invited scholars, writers, and scientific minds, men and women who valued intellect over social standing. "You seem surprised," he observed as they walked through the gardens on the second afternoon, having spent the morning in spirited debate with a visiting astronomer. "I confess I am," Harriet admitted. "This is not the typical country gathering." I have never aspired to typicality. He guided her toward a stone bench overlooking a small pond. May I speak plainly, Miss Thornfield? Her heart performed a treacherous flutter. I would expect nothing less. I returned to England prepared to fulfill my family obligations, to secure the succession through an advantageous marriage, as generations of Winthrops have done before me. His expression turned contemplative. I anticipated a tedious process of evaluating suitable candidates based on bloodlines and dowries. How very livestock-like, Harriet observed dryly. His laugh rang out. Precisely. And then I encountered you, hiding in a library, absorbed in Egyptian hieroglyphics, utterly indifferent to the matrimonial circus. Do you know how refreshing that was? To discover a woman who valued knowledge above social positioning. Harriet found herself unable to meet his gaze. You flatter me unnecessarily, Lord Halsey. Alexander, he corrected gently. And I merely state facts. In the week since, you have challenged my opinions, introduced me to new ideas, and never once simpered or pretended interest in subjects that bore you. Your honesty is as remarkable as your intellect. She looked up then, searching his face for signs of mockery or manipulation, finding none. Society would consider your assessment peculiar. I have been deemed too plain for marriage since my first season. Society, he said firmly, is frequently wrong. Beauty fades, Miss Thornfield, but a keen mind and genuine character only grow more valuable with time. He hesitated, then added softly, I find myself increasingly certain that I could face 50 years of breakfast conversations with you without experiencing a moment of tedium. The declaration hung between them, its implications both thrilling and terrifying. Harriet felt the foundations of her carefully constructed worldview, the acceptance of spinsterhood, the embrace of intellectual pursuits as compensation for romantic disappointment, begin to crumble. You cannot mean, she began. I believe I do, he replied simply. But your family will adore your sharp wit and extensive knowledge, once they recover from the shock of my choosing for myself. The tongue can gossip themselves hoarse. I care not. Harriet stood abruptly, needing distance to gather her scattered thoughts. This is absurd. You hardly know me. He remained seated, giving her the space she sought. I know enough to recognize what matters. But I've discomforted you, which was not my intention. Perhaps we should rejoin the others. The remainder of the weekend passed in a blur of confusion for Harriet. Lord Halsey, Alexander, remained attentive but respectful, never pressing for a response to his implied declaration. By the time the Thornfield carriage departed on Monday morning, Harriet had convinced herself she had misinterpreted his meaning entirely. Reality reasserted itself upon their return to London. The town buzzed with news of their visit to Winthrop Manor, and speculation ran rampant. They say he intends to offer for you, her mother informed her over breakfast 3 days after their return. Lady Cartwright heard it directly from his aunt. Harriet set down her teacup with excessive care. Lady Cartwright is notoriously misinformed. The evidence suggests otherwise. He calls daily, seeks your company at every gathering, and has now introduced you to his inner circle. Lady Thornfield's expression softened. My dear, is it so difficult to believe a man might value substance over superficial beauty? Before Harriet could formulate a response, their butler announced Lord Halsey himself had arrived. When he entered the morning room, his typically composed demeanor showed signs of agitation. Forgive the early call, he said, bowing to Lady Thornfield before turning to Harriet. I hope for a private word, if that would be permissible. Lady Thornfield demonstrated remarkable alacrity in remembering an urgent household matter requiring her immediate attention. Once alone, Alexander paced before speaking. I've just come from White's, where I was subjected to the most insulting conversation regarding your character and our association. Harriet felt ice form in her stomach. I see. No, you don't, he said with uncharacteristic sharpness. Lord Pembroke suggested, implied, that my interest in you stemmed from some wager or jest. That a man of my standing could only pursue a woman of your... He faltered, clearly unwilling to repeat the exact words. My plainness. Harriet supplied, her voice steady despite the pain lancing through her chest. My lack of conventional appeal? These are not revelations, my lord. Alexander, he corrected automatically. And they are absurdities. Worse, they are cruelties perpetuated by small minds. He stopped pacing to face her directly. I challenged him. Called him out, in fact. Harriet gasped. You cannot duel over such trivialities. Your worth is no triviality, he replied, his voice low and intense. But you need not worry. His seconds called upon mine this morning. He has withdrawn his remarks and offered a public apology, which I have accepted. The matter is resolved without bloodshed, though I confess I'm somewhat disappointed. Despite everything, Harriet found herself smiling. Dueling over a spinster's honor. How very medieval of you. You persist in this self-deprecation, he said, moving to sit beside her. Why is it so difficult for you to accept that I might see in you what others have been too blind or too conventional to recognize? The question struck at the heart of Harriet's carefully constructed defenses. For years, she had accepted society's assessment, built her identity around intellectual pursuits rather than romantic aspirations, protected herself from disappointment by expecting nothing. Because, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, I have spent a lifetime being overlooked. I learned to find contentment in books and ideas because people proved unreliable in their affections. To believe otherwise now feels dangerous. Alexander reached for her hand, his touch gentle. The most valuable discoveries often require risk. When I left England 3 years ago, I was running from expectations, from the weight of my title, from the prescribed path of marriage and succession. I sought freedom in distant lands and ancient civilizations. His thumb traced small circles on her palm as he continued. What I discovered, through all my travels, was that freedom without purpose becomes merely drift. I returned prepared to fulfill my obligations, but dreading the emotional emptiness of a marriage based on bloodlines and connections. He looked up, meeting her gaze directly. And then I found you, brilliant, forthright, utterly yourself despite society's disapproval. You reawaken possibilities I had abandoned. Harriet's carefully maintained composure began to fracture. What you describe is infatuation, a temporary fascination with novelty. When that fades, it will be replaced by deeper understanding and mutual respect, he interrupted. Harriet, I'm not offering pretty words or temporary devotion. I'm offering partnership, intellectual, emotional, and yes, marital. The directness of his declaration left her momentarily speechless. I had planned a more formal proposal, he continued with a small smile. Perhaps in my library at Winthrop Manor, surrounded by the books that brought us together. But circumstances have accelerated my timeline. He slid from the settee to one knee before her, still holding her hand. Harriet Thornfield, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because society dictates it, but because I cannot imagine a future without your mind challenging mine, your perspective broadening my own, your company enriching every day. Tears formed unexpectedly in Harriet's eyes. You will be mocked for choosing me. Let them mock, he replied without hesitation. Their opinions matter not. Your family may object. They will learn to appreciate your worth, as I have. I will never be a conventional viscountess." At this, his smile widened. "Thank God for that. Conventional viscountesses are terribly dull at breakfast." A laugh escaped her then, watery but genuine. "You are either the most peculiar viscount in England or the most courageous." "I aim to be both," he said, his expression growing serious again. "But I require an answer, Harriet. Will you marry me?" In that moment, Harriet felt the final pieces of her protective armor fall away. The belief that had sustained her through years of disappointment, that she was unsuitable for marriage, unworthy of romantic love, crumbled in the face of his unwavering regard. "Yes," she whispered, and then more firmly, "Yes, I will marry you." His joy was transformative, illuminating his features as he rose to sit beside her again. "You have made me the happiest of men." "And I," she admitted, allowing herself to lean slightly into his warmth, "am unexpectedly, thoroughly happy." The banns were read the following Sunday, prompting a flurry of shocked whispers throughout the congregation. Lady Bromley's expression of slack-jawed disbelief alone was worth the price of enduring public scrutiny, Harriet decided. Their wedding, held 6 weeks later at St. George's in Hanover Square, was notable for both its distinguished guest list and the animated intellectual debate that broke out between the bride and groom during the wedding breakfast, concerning the relative merits of Ptolemaic versus Copernican astronomical models. Most irregular, the Dowager Countess of Wexford sniffed to her companion. Most refreshing, corrected a visiting French scholar. A marriage of minds as well as fortunes. 5 years later, the Viscount and Viscountess Halsey were known throughout England not merely for their unconventional match but for their salon, a gathering of the brightest minds in science, literature, and philosophy. Their home became a center for intellectual exchange, with Harriet's sharp insights and Alexander's adventurous spirit creating an atmosphere unlike any other in London society. "I was thinking," Alexander said one morning as they shared breakfast in their library, surrounded by books acquired during their extensive travels, "that perhaps we might journey to Greece next spring. The archaeological excavations at Olympia show promise, and I recall your interest in classical mythology." Harriet looked up from her correspondence with a French astronomer regarding her observations of Saturn's rings. "What a wonderful suggestion! Though we shall have to delay our departure until after April." His brow furrowed slightly. "Is there some obligation I've forgotten?" "Not forgotten," she replied, her hand drifting to rest on her still flat stomach. "Simply not yet announced." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by incandescent joy. "Truly?" "The physician confirmed it yesterday." Her smile matched his. "It seems our family is expanding, much like our library." Alexander moved swiftly to kneel beside her chair, pressing his lips to her hand. "I find myself once again the happiest of men." "As am I the happiest of women," Harriet replied softly, despite being too plain for marriage. His laugh was warm against her skin. "The ton's loss has been my immeasurable gain." And in that moment, surrounded by books and bathed in morning light, Harriet Thornfield Winthrop silently thanked the society that had deemed her unsuitable. For in being overlooked, she had found the freedom to become fully herself, and in that authenticity she had found a love that valued her mind as much as her heart.